Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip has to do with an option payment for due diligence in the GAR or Georgia Association of Realtors contract. What does it mean? How does it work? What happens? What's it all about? So let's dive in. Stay tuned till the end because there's one part of it from a seller's perspective you may not have considered, and I will give you a special stipulation to help out a seller with respect to an option payment for due diligence. So what am I even talking about? In the GAR, the Georgia Association of Realtors Purchase and Sale Agreement, form F201, under paragraph A8 and the additional explanation in B8, it talks about inspection and due diligence. It has a due diligence period. Property is being sold subject to a due diligence period of blank number of days from the binding agreement date. Then 8B has two parts to it. Option payment for due diligence period. In consideration of the seller granting the buyer the option to terminate this contract, the buyer, number one, has paid the seller $10 non-refundable option money, the receipt and sufficiency of which is hereby acknowledged. Okay, before I even go any further, what is all of that about? Well, let's back up. A due diligence period, in essence, is the seller granting the buyer the option to terminate the contract within that time frame for any or no reason. So in essence, what it is it creates, if there is a due diligence period in the contract, it creates a mini option contract within the broader context of all the other terms of the purchase and sale agreement. So another way to think about it is nothing else in the purchase and sale agreement really kicks in or is enforceable until we get past this due diligence period to find out if the buyer is going to exercise the option to terminate the contract or continue. If the buyer does continue and does not terminate the contract, then the rest of the contract kicks in. So if you think about it in those terms, then the option contract, as I said, is the due diligence period is a mini option contract within the broader context of the entire purchase and sale. Well, as you know, for enforceability of a contract, there has to be consideration. So that's why that sentence is there. That in consideration of $10, the receipt non-refundable $10, receipt and sufficiency of which is hereby acknowledged. That's just legalese, if you want to think of it that way. Those $10 never changes hands. It's just because we are creating this mini option contract for the buyer. The seller grants the buyer the option to terminate for any or no reason before going on with the rest of the terms of the contract. Now, let's look at the next part, and this is the part that I really want to focus on. So the next part states, in paragraph Purchase and Sale Agreement GAR F201, paragraph A8B2. Bingo. It says, again, in consideration of the seller granting the buyer the option to terminate, the buyer, this is number 2, shall pay directly to the seller additional option money. The additional is in addition to that $10 that I just discussed. Additional option money of blank amount of dollars by check, ACH, or wire transfer of immediately available funds, either as of the offer date or within so many days of the binding agreement date. Any additional option money paid by the buyer to the seller either shall or shall not be applied towards the purchase price at closing, subject to lender's approval, and shall not be refundable to the buyer unless the closing fails to occur due to a default of the seller. Okay, that is a mouthful. What on earth does all of that mean? Well, and why is it even there? That has been in the GAR contracts for a few years, but we have not seen it used that widely until recently And the reason is this is February 2021, and we are in an extremely competitive, fast-paced seller's market. What that means is there is less inventory than there are buyers. So there are a lot of buyers that are competing for the same contract for the same property. So and we've talked about this in other videos, there are many strategies a buyer will use to entice a seller to take their offer over a competitive another buyer's offer. One of the ways, we've talked about this with waiving appraisals, making it all cash, all kinds of longer temporary occupancy, all kinds of other strategies. Well, this is one strategy that a lot of buyers are using, again, to entice, do you like that word, entice a seller to take their offer over a competitive offer. What this is additional money that goes directly from the buyer to the seller. It's not part of earnest money. It's not considered trust funds. It does not go in an escrow account. It goes directly from a buyer to a seller. It is completely non-refundable unless the seller defaults on the contract. And it either may or may not be applied towards whatever the buyer's cash to close is at closing if it closes. But the buyer does not get this back. So you buyer's agents, you need to make sure that your buyers understand they're not going to get this money back. It is completely non-refundable, like I said, unless the seller defaults. Doesn't go through you. It goes directly from the buyer to the seller. So would that be enticing for a seller to take that buyer's offer over another one? Of course, it's additional money that the seller gets regardless. So that is why it is there, and that's why we are seeing it used a lot recently in this competitive environment that we're in. It is just one of a number of strategies that buyers are using to entice a seller to choose their offer over other offers that the seller is considering. So, okay, I've highlighted those points. Now, before I get into that, let me even back up. In the RE forms contracts, there is also a due diligence period, which is also an option period. They call it the buyer's right to terminate period. It is the same thing, and if a buyer and a seller negotiate for that on the RE forms, it is the same thing conceptually. It does create a mini option contract within the broader context of the terms of the purchase and sale. Now, back on the GAR forms. Do not be confused. If you are looking at the GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors forms, there is another form. It is F240 option agreement. That has nothing to do with what we are talking about. This is additional option money for a due diligence period. An option agreement, form F240, that has nothing to do with due diligence. That is a buyer having an agreement with a seller for the option to enter into a purchase and sale agreement. So the option agreement, form F240, is a completely separate issue. And that, again, has nothing to do with additional option money for a due diligence period. And again, when I say additional, it's additional to that $10, the receipt and sufficiency of which is hereby acknowledged. Again, don't get it confused. That's nothing to do with earnest money, trust money. It doesn't have the protection of earnest money. It is, in essence, cash the buyer gives to the seller to take their offer over another offer. Now, all good and well, awesome for the buyer, awesome for the seller. If the seller does accept a buyer's offer, if they do make the decision in a competitive situation to, you buyer's agents, I would not necessarily, you're going to have this discussion with your buyers, but it is definitely a strategy in a competitive situation. If it's not a competitive situation, it might not be in a buyer's best interest to give the seller non-refundable money if the seller is not entertaining any other offers and they're just going to negotiate the contract as is. So tip to you buyer's agents, definitely one of the arrows in your quiver, so to speak, in a competitive situation. From the seller's perspective, yes, absolutely. If I've got a competitive situation and I'm trying to decide among a variety of offers, if there's one where I'm going to get this additional non-refundable money, and if we close, sure, I'll be more than happy to apply it towards what the buyer owes at closing. And if it doesn't close, as long as I don't default, yep, extra money to take the property off the market for however long we negotiate that due diligence time frame to be. Great idea for a seller, great enticement, and just a good strategy. However, okay, here's the tricky part. You listing agents, how are you going to protect a seller? If a seller is accepting an offer with additional option money and they're going to take the property off the market, they're going to go binding with this buyer. Great for the buyer. Buyer got the contract. What happens, however, if the buyer never sends the seller that additional option money? Then what? Well, after the fact, it's very difficult to do something. Does the seller have termination rights? Not unless you wrote it in there. A due diligence period is only an option for the buyer to terminate. A seller does not have termination rights during a due diligence period. So, here is a special stipulation, you listing agents. If you receive an offer from a buyer that has this additional option money for due diligence, you will probably want to protect the seller's interests and make a counter offer that is going to include the following special stipulation. And this special stipulation would be, here it is. All parties acknowledge and agree that upon acceptance of the contract, buyer shall pay a non-refundable option payment for seller to take the property off the market for a period equivalent to the due diligence period herein. The option fee shall be X amount of dollars payable to the sellers. Said option money shall be separate and apart from the earnest money stated herein. Now here's the part for you listing agents to protect your sellers. Should the buyer fail to pay said money within 2 days of the binding agreement date, seller shall have 5 days in which to terminate the contract, or the seller shall have waived the right to the option money. That special stipulation is courtesy of Amee Davis of Davis and Associates. So again, this is a great stipulation to protect your sellers, because if you don't include that, here's the deal. The buyer said, seller, I'm going to give you this non-refundable option money for the due diligence to take the property off the market. What happens if the buyer never pays it? Does the seller have termination rights? No, unless you use that special stipulation, giving the seller termination rights should the buyer never give the seller that additional option money. So, I think that's it. Pretty short and sweet. Hopefully you found this video tip informational and helpful. I'd love to hear your comments below. What has your experience been with additional option money? And again, it's in addition to that $10. Love to hear your comments. Is this a good strategy? Has it been effective for your buyers? You listing agents, have any sellers been burned if you hadn't used that stipulation to give them termination rights to go on to another contract? Would love to hear your thoughts and your experience with it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.